What if I told you that you've been trained to police your own mind? That every time you dismiss a thought as wrong, inappropriate, or dangerous, you're participating in a system of control so sophisticated that you don't even realize you're its enforcer. Michel Foucault, one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century, discovered something terrifying about modern society. We've been conditioned to fear our own thoughts, not by force, not by violence, but by something far more insidious. A system that makes us believe we're free while we voluntarily imprison our own minds. This isn't just philosophy. This is the blueprint for how power operates in the modern world. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. Right now, as you're watching this video, your mind is engaging in what Foucault called disciplinary power, the automatic surveillance and correction of your own thoughts. You're not just thinking. You're monitoring your thinking, judging it, correcting it, making sure it stays within acceptable boundaries. But here's the question that will change everything. Who decided what thoughts are acceptable? And why did you agree to let them? Foucault spent his life studying what he called the archaeology of knowledge, how societies determine what can be thought, said, and believed at any given moment. What he discovered was revolutionary. The most effective forms of control aren't imposed from outside. They're cultivated from within. In his masterwork, Discipline and Punish, Foucault revealed how modern society replaced physical punishment with psychological discipline. We no longer need guards to watch us because we've learned to watch ourselves. We've internalized the warden. Think about your own mental experience. How often do you catch yourself thinking something and immediately judge it as bad, weird, or wrong? How often do you silence thoughts before they're fully formed? How often do you feel guilty for having certain ideas, desires, or questions? This isn't natural. This is learned behavior. And Foucault showed us exactly how it was taught. The genius of modern power, according to Foucault, is that it doesn't tell you what to think. It teaches you how to think about thinking. It creates what he called regimes of truth, systems that determine not just what's true or false, but what kinds of questions are even allowed to be asked. This is why you feel anxious when you have thoughts that don't fit the accepted narrative. It's not because the thoughts are actually dangerous. It's because you've been conditioned to experience non-conforming thoughts as threatening to your social survival. Foucault's concept of biopower reveals how this works. Instead of controlling bodies through physical force, modern societies control minds through the management of knowledge, discourse, and identity. We're not told what to believe. We're taught what it means to be a rational, normal, healthy person. And then we police ourselves to maintain that identity. The psychiatric system, educational institutions, media, and social networks all function as what Foucault called apparatus of knowledge. Systems that don't just transmit information, but shape the very categories through which we understand ourselves and our possibilities. Here's where it gets disturbing. Foucault discovered that the most effective form of control is when the controlled person believes they're free. You think you're choosing your thoughts, but you're actually selecting from a pre-approved menu of acceptable ideas. This is what Foucault meant by mental slavery, not the absence of thought, but the presence of constrained thinking that feels like freedom. You can think anything you want, as long as it fits within the boundaries of what's considered reasonable, healthy, or productive. But who set these boundaries? And what happens to the thoughts that fall outside them? Foucault's research into the history of madness revealed something shocking. What we call mental illness is often just thinking that doesn't conform to current social norms. The same thoughts that were considered divine inspiration in one era become symptoms of disorder in another. This isn't to say that genuine psychological suffering doesn't exist. It's to recognize that the line between normal and abnormal thought is largely arbitrary and historically contingent. What we consider obviously true today would have been unthinkable heresy just centuries ago. The implications are staggering. If the boundaries of acceptable thought are socially constructed, then they can be changed. But more importantly, they can be challenged. Foucault's analysis of what he called the clinical gaze showed how modern institutions create knowledge by categorizing, measuring, and pathologizing human experience. The medical model doesn't just treat illness, it defines what counts as illness in the first place. This is how thought control works in the modern world. You're not told what to think. You're taught to pathologize certain types of thinking. Questioning authority becomes oppositional defiant disorder. Intense emotions become mood disorders. Non-conforming behavior becomes personality disorders. The result is what Foucault called docile bodies, individuals who have learned to regulate themselves according to external standards they've internalized as their own judgment. You become your own prison guard, your own censor, your own enforcer of mental conformity. But here's what makes this particularly insidious. The system works by making you believe that your self-regulation is for your own good. You're not being controlled. You're being helped to think more clearly, more rationally, more appropriately. Foucault's concept of pastoral power explains how this works. Like a shepherd guiding sheep, modern institutions guide your thinking by claiming to know what's best for you. They don't force compliance. They cultivate desire for compliance. The therapeutic discourse, educational psychology, and self-help culture all function as forms of pastoral power. They teach you to examine your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors through the lens of optimization, health, and adjustment. The goal isn't to understand yourself. It's to fix yourself according to predetermined standards. This is why Foucault considered psychology and psychiatry to be fundamentally political, not just scientific. They don't just describe human nature. They actively shape it by defining what counts as normal, healthy, or desirable. The confession, which Foucault studied extensively, becomes the model for modern subjectivity. You're constantly required to examine yourself, speak your truth, reveal your inner thoughts, not for liberation, but for more sophisticated forms of control. Social media, therapy culture, and personal development all function as modern confession systems. You're encouraged to share your most intimate thoughts and feelings, ostensibly for connection and growth, but actually for surveillance and normalization. Every time you post about your mental health struggles, every time you discuss your therapy insights, every time you share your personal journey, you're participating in what Foucault called the incitement to discourse, the proliferation of talk about the self that enables more refined forms of control. This doesn't mean therapy is bad or that sharing is wrong. It means recognizing that these practices occur within systems of power that shape their meaning and effects. The same action can be liberating or controlling depending on the context and the structures that contain it. Foucault's most radical insight was that power isn't something that's imposed on you from outside. It's something that flows through you, shapes you, and ultimately becomes you. You don't just submit to power, you become a vehicle for its operation. This is why simply rebelling against authority isn't enough. The rebel often remains trapped within the same system of thought that created the thing they're rebelling against. True resistance requires what Foucault called thinking otherwise, developing new categories, new questions, new ways of relating to yourself and reality. The question becomes, how do you break free from mental slavery when the chains are invisible and the prison is your own mind? Foucault's answer wasn't simple rebellion or rejection of all systems. It was what he called the practice of freedom, a continuous process of questioning, examining, and transforming the ways you relate to yourself and your thoughts. This practice begins with what Foucault termed genealogy, tracing the historical origins of the ideas you take for granted. When you feel shame about a particular thought or desire, ask yourself, where did this shame come from? What historical forces shape the categories that make this thought seem wrong or dangerous? Foucault's genealogical method revealed that many of our most basic assumptions about human nature, morality, and mental health are relatively recent inventions. The idea that you should constantly monitor and optimize your mental states, for example, would have been foreign to most humans throughout history. The concept of mental illness, as we understand it today, didn't exist before the 19th century. What we now call depression was once called melancholia, and was considered a mark of philosophical depth. What we now call anxiety was once called nervous sensitivity, and was associated with artistic temperament. This isn't to romanticize suffering, but to recognize that the categories we use to understand psychological experience are historically contingent. They're not eternal truths about human nature. They're temporary frameworks that serve particular social functions. Understanding this genealogy is liberating because it reveals that the thoughts you've been taught to fear might not be as dangerous as you've been led to believe. The voice in your head that constantly judges, corrects, and censors your thinking isn't your authentic self. It's the internalized voice of social control. Foucault's concept of care of the self offers a different approach. Instead of constantly trying to fix, optimize, or improve yourself according to external standards, you learn to cultivate a relationship with yourself based on curiosity, acceptance, and experimentation. This ancient practice, which Foucault studied in Greek and Roman philosophy, involved what he called technologies of the self, practices designed not to conform to social norms, but to develop your own capacity for ethical judgment and authentic self-expression. The difference is crucial. Modern self-help culture teaches you to modify yourself to fit predetermined templates of success, happiness, or mental health. Care of the self teaches you to develop your own criteria for what constitutes a meaningful, authentic life. This requires what Foucault called parrhesia, fearless speech, the courage to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable, unpopular, or dangerous. But the most important truth you need to speak is to yourself about yourself. Parrhesia isn't just about external honesty. It's about internal honesty. It's about acknowledging thoughts, feelings, and desires that don't fit your self-image or social expectations. It's about refusing to censor your inner experience, even when that experience is messy, contradictory, or socially unacceptable. This is terrifying for most people because we've been conditioned to believe that our thoughts reflect our character, that having bad thoughts makes us bad people. But Foucault understood that thoughts are just mental events. They don't define you unless you identify with them completely. The practice of freedom involves what Foucault called desubjectification, the process of loosening your identification with the socially constructed categories that define your identity. You're not just your diagnosis, your profession, your political beliefs, or your psychological profile. You're a dynamic, evolving process of becoming. This doesn't mean rejecting all structure or living in chaos. It means recognizing that the structures that organize your experience are provisional, changeable, and ultimately in service of your ongoing development, rather than fixed constraints on your possibilities. Foucault's analysis of resistance showed that the most effective forms of opposition aren't direct confrontation with power, but what he called counter-conducts, alternative ways of thinking, feeling, and being that open up new possibilities for human experience. These counter-conducts don't necessarily look like rebellion. They might look like curiosity, creativity, genuine questioning, or simply the refusal to accept that things have to be the way they are. They're subtle practices that gradually expand your sense of what's possible. The goal isn't to eliminate all forms of discipline or structure from your life. The goal is to choose consciously which structures serve your authentic development and which ones constrain it. This requires developing what Foucault called ethical discrimination, the ability to distinguish between life-enhancing and life-diminishing forms of power. Some forms of discipline are necessary for human flourishing. The discipline required to develop a skill, to maintain relationships, or to create something meaningful is different from the discipline that simply enforces conformity. The key is learning to tell the difference. This is why Foucault emphasized that freedom isn't the absence of constraints. It's the conscious choice of which constraints to accept and which to resist. It's about becoming an active participant in shaping the forces that shape you, rather than a passive victim of them. The practice of freedom requires what Foucault called critical ontology of ourselves, an ongoing investigation into who you are, how you became that way, and what you might become. This isn't narcissistic self-obsession. It's a form of philosophical inquiry that recognizes your life as a work of art in progress. You're not trying to discover your true self as if it's a fixed essence waiting to be uncovered. You're actively creating yourself through the choices you make, the practices you engage in, and the relationships you cultivate. You're both the artist and the artwork. This creative dimension of selfhood is what Foucault called aesthetics of existence. The idea that you can approach your life with the same creativity, intentionality, and aesthetic sensitivity that an artist brings to their work. This doesn't mean living superficially or focusing only on appearances. It means recognizing that every choice you make, how you think, how you respond to challenges, how you relate to others, is an opportunity to create something beautiful, meaningful, and authentic. The ultimate goal isn't to escape all systems of power, which is impossible, but to develop what Foucault called practices of liberty, ways of engaging with power that preserve and expand your capacity for self-determination. These practices include questioning received wisdom, experimenting with different ways of being, cultivating relationships based on mutual recognition rather than domination, and refusing to let others define the boundaries of your possibilities. Most importantly, they include the courage to think your own thoughts, feel your own feelings, and pursue your own questions even when they lead you into territory that others find uncomfortable or threatening. The mental slavery Foucault warned about isn't imposed by external force. It's maintained by your own fear of your own mind. The path to freedom begins with the radical act of befriending your own thoughts, including the ones you've been taught to fear. Your mind isn't your enemy. Your thoughts aren't your masters. Your inner experience isn't evidence of your pathology. They're the raw material of your freedom, if you have the courage to engage with them consciously and creatively.